Shall I use Fusion Studio as a standalone application, or should I use Fusion inside DaVinci Resolve, or is there even a reason to do both? I got this question quite a few times, especially since Blackmagic has now aligned the interfaces for Fusion between Fusion Studio 16 and DaVinci Resolve 16. So the question really came up, why are there still two software packages for basically the same Fusion functionality? So I decided to record my thoughts and insights on this and share with you. To answer the question in short, if you are 100% focused on editing and every now and then you need like a lower third or a title effect or something like this, then DaVinci Resolve is fully sufficient. You don't need the standalone version. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're 100% focused on compositing, you don't do any editing, you don't do any color grading, then Fusion Studio is completely sufficient. You don't need to learn the extra stuff of DaVinci Resolve, and you can stick to this version. Now, I suspect many people are somewhere in between, and this is why I created this video. So in this video, I want to talk about three parts. I want to talk about differences in the workflow between standalone and Resolve and the organization of your compositing scripts. I want to talk a bit about stability and performance, which may be a deciding factor for many people. And I want to talk about what are the actual feature differences. And at the end, I might give you a few quick tips about how you can move between both applications if you're using both. Before I get started, one quick little note on this little thing. If you have the Fusion dongle of any recent Blackmagic Fusion version, you can use Fusion Studio up to version 16, possibly beyond, and you can also use the same dongle with DaVinci Resolve Studio. On the other hand, if you have the Resolve dongle, you can use Fusion Studio 16. It's now supported, but previous versions of Fusion did not support the DaVinci Resolve dongle. If you have the license key installation of DaVinci Resolve, I believe you are still out of luck. It is not supported in Fusion as per my knowledge. So if you have any dongle, you should be fine. So let me plug it in and let's jump right in. Now, from a workflow perspective, the Fusion standalone version works pretty much like a file editor. Yeah? So you have your media on your file system, you have your Fusion comp files, where you're saving your Fusion work in the file system wherever you like, and you can directly access it from the file system. For example, here I have a Fusion comp, which I have edited here. I can save it to disk, I can save it somewhere else. My work itself, the name of this Fusion composition is just the file name, and that's it. If I want to switch, I can have multiple tabs here. And can switch between them. If I remember something I did 2 weeks ago, I can maybe find it still under recent files, and I just open the Fusion comp the way I open a file. Inside the comp, I have my loader sequences where I load the media from the disk, and I have at the end of my comp, this one doesn't have one, but assuming I want to render it to disk, I put a saver node at the end, and then I can click on render at the end, render to disk. That's it. So it's pretty much like opening a text editor. Yeah. There are ways to manage projects. There's the bin directory, there's the studio player, especially for collaborative works, that is available. But from a basic principle, you can use it, just open your Fusion file, save your Fusion file. That's it, nothing else to worry about. On the other hand, in DaVinci Resolve, the whole thing is a bit capsuled in. So if I look into a Resolve project, I have my media pool where I have loaded all the media into DaVinci Resolve. I can use my optimized media, etc., and do all the media management inside DaVinci Resolve. Then I can create my timelines, and in my timeline I can then go to my specific Fusion clip and open that clip inside the Fusion tab of DaVinci Resolve, and then I have opened that particular clip directly from Resolve, and where it's on the file system I don't care about. Actually, I don't even know about it. So the Fusion comp itself is stored together with the project settings of that particular Resolve project. So if I'm editing, the advantage is, of course, I can look into my clips and can jump between clips the way they are in the timeline. I have everything organized the way it is organized from an editing editing perspective. From a pure compositing perspective, if I suddenly remember something cool I did like 2 weeks ago or so on another project and think I can reuse something, I will have to reopen that project. And so I have to go via the project manager in DaVinci Resolve and find that project again and go there. I can't just, like in Fusion Standalone, open a few clips in parallel, Fusion comps in parallel and compare them side by side. Now I can here go via right-click, look at different compositions from one clip. I can change the clips and so on. But the whole way I go into my Fusion area and the way it's saved and organized is all linked to that edit project. Now, for compatibility and speaking about going from one to the other, I can export this, I can copy and paste. So one thing, for example, I can here just copy my flow, Control C, and then go over to Fusion, create a new Fusion comp, Control V, and it complains about the media in, media out nodes, which don't exist in Fusion Standalone, but otherwise I can copy the flow over. Now I have to replace my media in, media out with loader and saver nodes, because Fusion Standalone doesn't know what media in and out is. This is the part of Resolve where I'm linking my Resolve clips from the media pool. In Fusion Standalone, I have to now replace this with saver and loader, but otherwise I can copy and paste back and forth. Also, if I do want to have the file the way I have it here from Fusion Standalone, if I want this comp file, for example for sharing, I can just go to File and use from the Fusion page, import and export Fusion comp, which imports and exports this file. So this simple compositing script, this simple file from the standalone version, it's still possible to get it from Resolve, but it's all hidden inside the edit methodology. It's not as visible and directly accessible as from the Fusion Standalone. By the way, a quick side note, maybe you know it, maybe you don't. This file here is nothing else but a text file. If I want, I can open it in a text editor and I can read my Fusion comp in text format. So this is basically a scripting language if you want. Yeah, and all the tools and the parameters and so on I can open in text format. I don't use that very often, but every once in a while I come across a scenario where, for example, I have multiple clips that I moved and I just want to change the file name or so, and I can do a search and replace in this file. So you can edit it in text format in principle. This is also maybe useful in some cases where people want to combine Fusion with other tools, do some scripting on their own outside of Fusion and so on. So the way Fusion is built here is really very modular, accessible, without too much around. So I think advantage and disadvantage of these workflows are clear. So advantage for an editor who has the whole project, you can have it the way organized, the way you actually use it in the edit, and you can jump around as per your timeline, what you're familiar with. Advantage for the compositor, if you're in the standalone version, just open 5, 6 composites, whatever project they are from. Don't worry about the whole level of organization around that Resolve brings by default. So let me come to the point of stability and performance. First of all, stability. Now, crashes while working are extremely annoying, and I'm sorry to say they still happen, both in Resolve and in Fusion Standalone. But overall, DaVinci Resolve got better in the stable versions of release 15. In the beta version of Resolve 16, I'm still having some problems, but hopefully they're being sorted out. All in all, Fusion Standalone has less complexity around and I guess just less options for failure and has been running more stable. I think that has been the common experience of many users of Fusion 9, and I think even with 16 this may still be the case. So now let's hope that someday soon we don't have to talk about stability anymore. Let's assume both run perfectly fine. Still, the question is there a performance difference between Resolve and Fusion? Now, if you just start both applications side by side, you see that Fusion Studio uses like a few hundred megabytes for the interface and Resolve uses maybe twice as much. Now, if you have 30 gigabyte of RAM or 60 gigabyte of RAM, whether your GUI uses 100 megabyte more or less is probably not the issue. Now, if I open my task manager, I actually see that here I see Fusion Studio running with some 400 megabyte of memory. I'm not doing any rendering at the moment, so CPU and GPU are not really taxed. So I see here a few hundred megabyte, and DaVinci Resolve I see 37 gigabyte of RAM usage. Now, why is that if I'm not doing anything? Well, DaVinci Resolve, because of the way I have set up this project, is automatically caching stuff, right? So it's automatically pre-rendering things from Fusion, and it's loading my caching from the edit page, which is coming all by default, all automatically without me doing anything. So I think that's the real difference. It's not that whether the GUI uses a few hundred megabyte more or whether the GUI has, loading a few functionalities more or less. It's more about when you're loading your project, do you have all this caching which is happening automatically by default, or do you just, like in Fusion, open a text file basically? Right? Then Fusion also, once I start running it, of course I can also cache things, but I know in standalone, I know I'm only within my comp. I'm not doing anything else. In DaVinci Resolve, I have to pay attention because by default, I may be doing lots of other things as well. Now I propose that a similar logic may also apply to file management, and you may disagree with this. I just put it out here. So in Resolve, when I take things from the media pool, I just drag and drop it over to Fusion, or I just go for my editing timeline over to Fusion. I have my media in node and everything else is by default hidden from me. I immediately start from my media in node. In the standalone version, I have to consciously add a loader or take a file sequence or a file and load. Now, when I do this loading by myself, I think about what codec do I have and is that fine for what I'm about to do. For example, if I know that I'm doing something very complex and that the loader will read again and again, I may not want to use a compressed format. For example, I may want to go to, I don't want to use H.265 or something like this. I may want to use a file sequence. In the standalone version, because I'm taking the files from the disk, use the loader node, I'm thinking about this. In Resolve, everything is in my edit page, and maybe my H.265 is fine for editing if my machine can handle it. But then when it comes to compositing, and if my composites get more complicated, maybe I should think about it again. And Fusion Standalone triggers me to do that thinking. Resolve may hide this from me. Now, last point, of course, are features, and the reason why I'm mentioning it last is because I think it's no longer the primary concern. You can look at the Blackmagic Design feature comparison, and they are now comparing the features of Fusion inside DaVinci Resolve 16 and Fusion Studio as the standalone version. And you see that the features are mostly aligned. Purely from a tool perspective, I know that the primate keyer is not available in DaVinci Resolve. That's only available in the Studio version. But the other keying tools, Delta Keyer, Ultra Keyer, and so on, they're all there. So I think also from a keying perspective, you're very well equipped in the DaVinci Resolve version. The differences that you do see, you see there's a resolution limit in DaVinci Resolve for 16K. I think for most people that won't be a big issue. You see that there's a big section on the Studio Player which is not available in DaVinci Resolve, and the reason is it's not needed. So the Studio Player is basically a tool for Fusion Studio to manage versions of comps and so on in a larger compositing pipeline. So if you're working in a multi-seed Fusion environment, for example, you can do version management and can review comps and so on in the Studio Player. In DaVinci Resolve, since everything is managed around the edit and around the timelines and so on, you have a different way of managing your comps, so it doesn't really make sense there. And you have different ways of collaboration based on your Resolve project. And now maybe with Frame.io, you have these online collaborations which are coming out with Resolve 16. So Fusion just has a different way of managing, and that's why they have this player. Now another big block of difference here is the render manager. Now in Fusion Studio you have network rendering enabled, and if I go into Fusion standalone here, if I render something, I have the option to say use network, and in this case whether or not I am actually in a network, it's being sent to a render manager. And if I file render manager, if I open it here, I see the comps in a queue, and I can add comps into that queue, and they are being then sent to the machines available. Now this is not available in DaVinci Resolve, and it doesn't really fit into the direct editing workflow and jumping back and forth and so on, but it fits into a compositing pipeline, and especially if you're in a larger environment with multiple machines and so on, this is definitely of interest. Now this is for rendering. Otherwise, from a feature perspective, I think it's worth noting that there's one difference from the GUI perspective, which I find still very important. In Fusion Studio, you can still, via window, open a new image view or new floating frame. So you can get a dedicated window where you can assign either any component of the GUI, basically. And I frequently use that to have an additional viewer on a second monitor. In Resolve, I can do it via my decklink card, and I can get pure grading output, basically. But sometimes I want to use my second monitor, for example, for rotoscoping, or to have the 3D view or stuff like this, and that doesn't work through a video output. That works just via the graphics card, second monitor connected, that's it. Now what I can do is I can add my detached viewer to that second monitor, and can output whatever I want to output into that view. Or I can even put my spline editor there, or the flow graph on a second monitor, and so on. So this way the GUI still has a bit more functionality, even though it looks otherwise the same way as in Resolve. As far as I'm aware, this is not yet possible in DaVinci Resolve. Otherwise, from a GUI, from the tool perspective and so on, the two are now really close, and I think there is not much difference anymore. Now, if you decide to use both tools in combination, maybe you use Fusion in Resolve for some simple things, and if composites go more complex and you have long render times and so on, perhaps you prefer the standalone version. If that is the case, one way you can import Fusion comps, what I have shown you before. You can copy and paste, except for maybe the media in, media out, and loader saver nodes, which is the one concept which is different, which you can manually change. But the most straightforward way is VFX Connect. Just right-click on a clip, VFX Connect clip, and then this clip, or if you have a layered timeline, multiple clips, the video portion of it is being rendered out to disk, typically a DPX file, to get started, and then that sequence is being loaded into Fusion Standalone, where you can do the rest of it. I recently got a request to do a more detailed tutorial on VFX Connect in particular. If there is demand for this, I think I can do this in one of the next days or weeks. But otherwise, just to get started, look for that feature, or just right-click and try it out. So this way you can go directly with a clip over into Fusion Standalone, work there, then render, then go back into the edit. For me, I typically do this when I know that it will get computationally intensive, that I want to close everything from the edit and I want to only focus, then I do that. Now, last part I should probably mention about the free version. With Fusion Studio 16, there is no free Fusion 16 at the moment, and I'm not sure if this is because they don't want to do beta testing with the free version and excluded it from the beta, or if they have discontinued it. Time will tell. So as of now, for Fusion 16 you have the standalone versions. For the free version you can still get the Fusion 9 free version, and of course DaVinci Resolve. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this quick overview. So to summarize, I think for me it's not so much the features why I'm using one or the other. It's more like the intentionality of the workflow. So when I am in the edit and just need a quick fix, of course I like to stay in Resolve. If I'm just trying something out, like a motion graphics design or something, and I don't need to edit, I go to the Fusion Studio by default. If I'm in the edit but I want to do something more complex, then I prefer to render it out, go over to Fusion, close my edit, close everything that's distracting, and then I can spend the next 2-3 hours or 2-3 days or whatever it is on that composite and render back when I'm done. So this is a bit how I approach this. I hope you find this useful. If you want to learn a bit more about VFX Connect or about anything else I touch based on in this video, please let me know in the comment. I may come up with some tutorials dedicated to this in the next days, weeks or so if there's interest. Otherwise, subscribe for more to come and see you next week. Thanks for watching.